everybody, and welcome back to Psychedelics Today. This is Joe Moore. Today on the show, we have Diana Quinn, ND, Director of Clinical Education, Naropa Center for Psychedelic Studies. We had a lovely conversation here, actually on the Naropa campus, which is always a treat. And we actually had the pleasure of meeting earlier this year at the Aspen Psychedelic Symposium, which was really fun as well. Had I forget, maybe breakfast or coffee or something. And that was great too. So really just lovely to get Diana on the show finally, and excited to learn about what's going on over at Naropa, which is always an interesting place. And yeah, just great to connect, and hopefully we can collaborate on some things in the future with Naropa. All right, well, enjoy this show with Diana Quinn, ND, and we will see you on the other side. Now, here we are at Naropa in Boulder. Diana Quinn, how are you today?
I'm great. How are you, Joe?
Lovely, lovely. I had the pleasure of meeting you at Aspen, their recent symposium this summer, and that was really fun. And I'm excited to finally get you on the show to learn about you, your background, and what's going on here at Naropa and more.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
I think we teed up a really interesting conversation that we'll save towards the close.
Mm-hmm.
So we're both excited to dig in on that one. So, starting, let's contextualize a little bit for folks, and then we can rewind the tape. So currently, what is your position here at Naropa?
My role is Director of Clinical Education at the Center for Psychedelic Studies.
Great. And what are your credentials? It feels like a rude question sometimes, but...
Sure. No, that's fine. So I am a licensed naturopathic doctor. I practiced for about 15 years, doing a range of different modalities of care, including oncology, integrative mental health care, mind-body medicine, and so on. And that work, particularly working in the mental health field, drew me closer to increased awareness of various options for treating mental illness, because a lot of the folks that I saw seeking integrative options for their mental well-being and whole person well-being were not getting the results that they were seeking from conventional methods. So yeah, discovering and tracking the psychedelic clinical research for many, many years, while also having my own personal background and exposure to psychedelic substances decades earlier, and kind of by way of having the opportunity to attend Indigenous ceremony beginning about 8, 10 or so years ago, really began to bridge some of my own personal spiritual journey and evolution with my clinical work. And in 2020, I closed my practice and pursued a career in the psychedelic world. So here I am doing education now. So
love that. And what I particularly like is the perspective of an ND coming in, and like my bias around that word is that we're looking at the whole person, more so than necessarily like, use this and your bacterial infection will clean up and hopefully get healthy again. And like, I think looking at the different layers of the person is super helpful.
yes.
It's like, do you really need, 20 ayahuasca sessions? Like perhaps not. Perhaps some talk therapy and some nutrition and sleep first.
Absolutely. Taking a holistic approach to the whole person, mind, body, spirit, and so on, social context. The circle keeps broadening more widely in terms of the context of the individual. And one of the things that I've been in a practice of, and I should just name that my own lineages of training and practice are beyond the naturopathic training and background, a orientation toward the framework of healing justice as a framework that seeks to intervene on and respond to the impacts of trauma in our collective hearts, minds, bodies, spirits, psyches, environments. And so that framework also is a lens that really not only seeks to reclaim many different traditional modes of healing that have been lost, stolen, interrupted, intervened on, but also really give a range of healing modalities primacy, not to diminish Western conventional medicine. It's an integrative approach, that I believe in, but also really for individuals and, more importantly, communities to be able to reclaim these tools of healing ourselves, and to demystify healing and really kind of situate this as part of community care, collective liberation. And so that's sort of the orientation I bring to all of my work, my practice as an ND, but also my work in the psychedelic space.
Cool. I initially thought you were going to go in the direction of like more specific kind of like collective things we need to clean up, like food deserts. But it sounds
Well,
like it's like a yes and. It was
all
like
of
a
it.
lot bigger.
Yeah, all of it. Because the context, one of the precepts of naturopathic medicine is to identify and treat the cause. And in my practice over many years, working with individuals who, because of the individualism embedded into the Western medical model of care, the healthcare, so-called healthcare system or disease management system of the medical industrial complex, people begin to really, many times are coming seeking individual solutions to really what are systemic and collective problems. And to identify and treat the cause, you go deeper and deeper and deeper to pulling that thread to what is the cause. And oftentimes, particularly in my practice where I worked with people who experienced marginalization because of their racialization, because of their gender identity, sexual orientation, disability status, and so on, really were and are living at these intersections where you mentioned food deserts, environmental justice issues, a whole range of different contributing factors to what then become individual medical or healthcare problems or mental health problems, but really have structural and systemic underpinnings and frameworks. So, my work really led me to activism because I don't think you can identify and treat the cause without becoming an activist. And also, there's so many different fronts to work on. And healing justice as a framework is really existing at the intersection of all of those movements: environmental justice, disability justice, racial justice, food justice, economic justice, et cetera. So, it's kind of a lens to apply to any work really that you're doing. And frankly, has an overtly anti-capitalist and abolitionist perspective because we understand that those systems really, kind of are at the core of racial capitalism, ecological destruction, and so on and so on. So, to me, really looking at psychedelics as this like one isolated, interesting, sexy field that is emergent as a so-called renaissance is not that it doesn't have a lot of potential for healing, and a lot of potential for communities and individuals to really do deep transformative healing, particularly around trauma and trauma, possibly even connected to these intersecting systems of oppression. But it doesn't obviously inherently do anything to change those systems, nor does it necessarily motivate people who have those experiences who aren't themselves affected by intersecting systems of oppression to really get involved to do anything about it. And sometimes quite the opposite. So,
Right. I think, carefully chosen words. It's like, it's not necessarily the case. Like we have Sam Gandy's work around, which is very limited case size, but talking about identification with nature, nature relatedness. And that's good. That's a start. I think there's a couple other small ones that we can lean on, but yeah, like more than half feel closer to the planet after a psychedelic session, which is good. So they start going, oh, maybe I shouldn't harm myself here.
right.
And or future generations. There's one thing around what you were talking about with justice that, one of our common threads here is drug war and like how hard that hits a lot of communities. And after incarceration, I believe a family doesn't like return to like the normative rate for 7 generations. I think the figure was like 5 or 7 generations. So right now you're back in this like economic normative range, which like it's really tragic because it's so many people and it's disproportionately people of color. And so, one of my songs is ending the drug war as part of this like abolitionist mentality.
Yes.
Not to mention all my friends who have died due to the drug war. So, incarceration and death is something that's like part of this larger conversation. So, let's talk about your entrance. Like how did these things come on your radar as something of interest? The psychedelics generally.
Well, sort of my introduction to psychedelics was many years ago in my late teens, early 20s, through my own personal experience. And I was really transformed by those experiences, and was a spiritual seeker, I guess, or someone who could see from a very early age that the consensus reality constructs that we're operating inside of are not inherently, that there's some arbitrariness to many of the conditions that we're existing inside of. And so those experiences were very formative. And my undergraduate studies were in cultural anthropology because I was interested in medical anthropology, understanding ethnobotany, exploring the role of ritual and ceremony cross-culturally, understanding the role that entheogens play in and other consciousness-altering states, consciousness altered states that are induced by other means. What the purpose is of non-ordinary states of consciousness. So really the majority, through ethnographic research, we know that across time and space, the propensity to seek and induce non-ordinary states of consciousness through the use of entheogenic plants, through fasting, through dance, through other forms of, trance induction. This is something that really kind of transcends, and I think we can agree from an anthropological perspective is really central to the human experience. And non-ordinary states have played a critical role in the evolution of human culture, right? Across time and space, have played a lot of different roles historically and in contemporary life that have ranged from maintaining the social fabric of a community to certainly having transcendent mystical experiences and our understanding of our place in the cosmos. I mean, so many things from practical to really esoteric and noetic. So I was very deeply interested in that from, as long as I can remember. So that was my background. And through my studies in anthropology, chose to, rather than pursue a track of an academic career in anthropology, decided to instead deepen my own study of ethnobotany and herbal medicine by going into naturopathic medicine and practicing myself. So that was kind of the trajectory that got me to naturopathic school. And, that's a pretty fringe way of practicing medicine, even though it, kind of is somewhat, kind of within, kind of the larger maybe model of holistic healthcare, which really has been quite, there's a whole, segment of the medical industrial complex that is sort of the wellness industry, and naturopathic medicine as a profession is still embedded somewhat inside that. But in any case, through many years of practice, as I mentioned, I had the opportunity to work with folks who had terminal diagnoses. I worked in oncology, as I mentioned, did some hospice care, myself got trained as an end-of-life doula, really worked with folks in liminal and transitional states, and also because I was working with folks that were suffering from mental health complaints of different kinds, really was, closely tracking the clinical research with psychedelics for many years, and began to work with folks that were themselves having either naturalistic use or exploring microdosing. And, as the body of data grew, it really became, compelling as an actual option, that I wanted to be able to move toward being able to offer my patients myself. So that kind of led me to get trained as a psychedelic assisted therapist. And, there are a lot of different trainings out there, and all of them have their strengths, and all of them, probably have their growth edges. And I really saw that there was a need broadly in the field around education for increasing a concentration on equity, not only in terms of accessibility and inclusion into training programs, but also bringing an anti-oppressive lens into the training itself to better prepare all folks who are doing this work to have a greater capacity for culturally responsive care. So that was kind of my motivation to get into education.
Right on. Do you recall offhand any of the first papers and or researchers you were tracking that kind of tickled that itch and said, yes, let's go forward?
I mean, I will definitely say that, the work of Monica Williams, I was really a fangirl for, Dr. Williams' work for a long time. I actually wrote to her at one point and was just like, I just thank you. And how can I, how can I hang out with you? So I've had the honor to be able to do that in a number of contexts. But I also was really a close follower of Alan Davis's work. And of course, he was doing psilocybin research with Hopkins, and also had the good fortune to have the opportunity to work with him at Ohio State, and participate in some survey research project on LGBTQ individuals with naturalistic psychedelic use that's currently pending publication. So yeah, so those were a couple. I've had the opportunity to actually work with some of my heroes in the field. Those are a couple names that come to mind.
That's awesome. Yeah. I only wish we could have had Monica on the show more often. I think maybe only twice to date.
She's busy.
She's doing stuff in Ottawa now, maybe.
Yeah, University of Ottawa.
Big move from where she was, but sometimes you got to move to Canada. So let's talk about what is happening here at Naropa, psychedelically speaking, that you can speak about.
Well,
there's plenty here that we can't talk about.
Perfect caveat.
Undergrads.
Yeah, right. Well, so here at the Center for Psychedelic Studies, we are currently running our third cohort of our psychedelic assisted therapy certificate training program. Over the years, we've trained probably of around 350 or so people through that program, maybe a little more. And we are also in our inaugural cohort of our Psilocybin Facilitator Training program, which operates under the state regulatory model, both here in Colorado as well as in Oregon. And both of our programs are fully accredited and licensed through OHA and NMHA.
So the Colorado-Oregon program is one program, and you could apply for a license in both states afterwards?
Correct.
Cool. Nice work.
Yeah. Yes. So the PAT certificate is a broad spectrum training program that's largely geared toward clinicians, although historically we have, on a case-by-case basis, enrolled non-clinicians, folks who have our lineage and legacy practitioners, Indigenous individuals that are lineage carriers. So we have been inclusive of non-licensed practitioners in that program, but it's largely geared as a postgraduate, secondary training certificate. And it's an 8-month program that includes a ketamine experiential. And then our new program, the Psilocybin Facilitator Training, is a hybrid online 150-hour training program with a practicum that we offer in Oregon through the Naropa Center. And then we will ultimately offer our own practicum, our own psilocybin practicum for our trainees here in the Boulder area, with a healing center coming in 2025.
So that's fun. And I think for me personally, the biggest question is the legal complexity around compliance given federally recognized education institution having to do, federally legal things, which is, a dance that I've been dancing for many years, not as a federally recognized body other than one that pays taxes, but I have to play by the rules, and PT just can't really be breaking the law.
Of course.
So like, I'm sure that was an interesting dance. Were you part of that?
Yeah. Well, yeah, we're actually in the process right now of finalizing a very comprehensive business plan that includes the establishment of multiple entities under which the psilocybin work will be done. So that will actually be distinct from the university itself. So currently the Center for Psychedelic Studies, although it is largely housed within the university, because it is not a degree conferring program, it sits inside the office of the president and is not actually an academic program. We are in the process of establishing and will be rolling out this year a psychedelic minor, and then in future we'll have a major and then a program for the master's in divinity concentration for psychedelic therapy, with the option for folks then to go on to gain their certification as psychedelic assisted therapists. But for right now, our center and all of our offerings, the certificate training programs, we're in the process of kind of separating those out from the umbrella of the university, and our clinic clearly will be a distinct entity altogether. So any work with psilocybin will be separate from the university.
What's an analogy? I'm trying to make up some cartoonish analogy. It's like Hopkins having like a constant, like a 8-month training and like, let's manufacture LSD and MDMA. Like, we have to figure out how to like separate that so like the main core organizations can be protected. And that's all of us are dancing this dance. And the amount of money we all have to spend on attorneys is like pretty outrageous just to be compliant. So, and mitigate or incarceration or other risks. Like I love to say I'm not going to do well in jail, so I'm going to avoid it. And I don't do well in court. Barely do well with lawyers. So all of us have to just dance this dance really skillfully.
Yes. And, you mentioned earlier the impacts of the drug war. And I think, because this is a point on which we, where we meet, that these state by state decriminalization efforts they're not a substitute for wide scale, legalization and, kind of a transformation of the entire carceral system, kind of around the way that not only psychedelics like psilocybin, MDMA, et cetera, but also other drugs and, kind of the way that we've seen even just the cannabis industry play out, and hoping that the unfoldment of psilocybin at the state level doesn't follow those same pathways. And I know that this is a major concern that some of the opponents of both the legislation here in Colorado and elsewhere, kind of have raised as a key objection, and out of concern in part to the well-being of the medicine itself, the lineages from which the medicines come, the impact on indigenous communities and lineage carriers and so on. Really, I think all of these are valid points that are in the mix when we're kind of talking about these state regulatory models, how to operate inside of them, how to stay abreast of the law, how to be compliant at the state level, but breaking the law federally, what that means. And for those of us that are operating within a pretty significant level of privilege, obviously, the impacts are, pale in comparison, right, to maybe other folks who are more gravely impacted by the drug war and so on, and all of these various systems. I think the problem with these decriminalization and state regulatory models, apart from the complexities of navigating state and federal legalities, also, and this is also the same for the medical model, for potential future psychedelic legalization, is that we're unfolding these very powerful medicines, many of which are living beings, plant beings, right, or fungi or cacti, inside of these systems and structures that are deeply embedded with human constructs, including, racism, sexism, et cetera. All of these, deeply problematic and colonial systems. And inevitably, you can't build inside of those systems without being affected by the same energy. I don't know, the same
chemistry
impacts.
is an apt analogy
Right.
here, right? Like you have to have the right pressure, the right ingredients. If you have extra stuff floating in the atmosphere, you might have a contaminated product.
Exactly.
It's just part of it.
Exactly. Right. And so, I think the question that's always been in my mind has been coming from a harm reduction lens, where my interest is, as I've mentioned, really kind of raising the bar around culturally responsive care, equity, and ethics within trainings, also increasing accessibility of training so that more historically excluded folks that have not had access or been welcome or had safety in those spaces can access them. And our center this last year gave roughly $250,000 worth of scholarships to historically excluded folks to, access our programs. And we, there's room for improvement, but we strive to create an anti-oppressive environment that centers the experience of those most impacted. So not saying, we're far from perfect, but, the aim to do that, to increase, access for those who are otherwise not part of the movement, part of the discussion, don't, have the ability to take these medicines back to their communities. That's really, been my motivation. And I think the question that I have is still, where is that tipping point where the contaminants in the system, right, kind of outweigh the, the potential benefits?
Us what we want. Like how we're cleaning this precursors up so we get the result we want. Yeah, it's a good topic, and I think we just need to keep supporting folks and get marginalized folks in. There was something there around. Have you had a conversation with Carl Hart yet?
I've not. No, I'm an admirer of his work, but I've never met him. Yeah.
My God. So 2 things. I would check out our podcast with him because I think it's one of the better pieces of content he's done. And then secondly, the YouTube of his recording at Horizons a few years back. Yeah, I've never seen such a good job done in front of such a super privileged New York audience. I thought that was one of the most amazing things. And it's at a psychedelic conference talking about just how racialized this whole thing has been and how problematic it is to say, oh, okay, yeah, the only thing we plan on decriminalizing is ayahuasca and mushrooms and blah, blah, blah. Cool. But that's tone deaf and really ignoring a lot of these other things. And Carl Hart, I think, is somebody that's done a really good job there. Because, I was chatting with a Rutgers medical sociologist somewhat recently about the drug war and this idea that LSD is the best drug or mushrooms are the best drug or, plant medicine. That could be true for X population, but for certain populations, perhaps it is the case that drugs that we don't like are a more ideal solution to their problems that they're experiencing. Is it really safe in projects of the Bronx or whatever in New York to be eating a bunch of acid? I think the answer is no.
Well, right. And this is something that also comes to my mind, even just inside these state programs, adult use models. Just the point about, are your basic needs met, for safe housing, for food security, for clean water, for gainful employment at a living wage. So these things aren't separate. And, I think to the...
It's the feed mushrooms to homeless people thing that I keep hearing over and over again.
Exactly.
I'm Good Lord. They have a right to it, but I don't think we need to necessarily be pushing that agenda.
Well, it's just really, it's profoundly missing the mark, right? I think, to the point earlier that we were discussing about whether or not, sure, there's some studies that show psilocybin increases nature awareness and, kind of recognizing that we are nature. And so therefore, maybe let's change our orientation. But I think in terms of motivating, the concept that giving unhoused people, psilocybin is the solution it just to me is so baffling because, not addressing houselessness, not addressing the criminalization of houselessness and poverty. I mean, just like going to the core of the issue, and those of us that have the privilege to, be able to seek novel and, previously unavailable therapies for our own well-being. I would love to see, that increased motivation to, try to come together to solve some of these social problems, which are also not there by mistake. I mean, they're built into the system, which, this is kind of the structural analysis that we really, try to bring, to our trainees and also to, the psychedelic exceptionalism that you were speaking to about, which drugs are good and permissible and which aren't, not to mention what's the impact of legalizing or decriminalizing plant medicine that is non-native to this continent, and thinking then what we're just going to import all the ayahuasca from, the Amazon.
Yes, we already are.
Well, right. But I mean, just without regard or consideration for the impacts there.
Recognize it's in Hawaii and just use that instead of
because Hawaii is also not stolen land and, colonized.
At least it's not impacting Peruvian populations. It's American populations,
yeah, but
quote unquote.
Yeah. I'm joking because it is. But yes. Yeah. But I mean, I think just to any idea that Hawaii of all places would be, kind of a more acceptable alternative because it's, so-called American soil is, I know that's something that's been
to me, it's
floated,
like a further fragmentation of native populations outside the reach of our country. I think let's cause our problems and sort out our problems here as opposed to playing out our drama with other countries of the global south. That's my position. I also think we should probably be consuming way less ayahuasca as a culture. I think there's other things we probably should be doing other than that. But in a lot of these plant medicine traditions, the only practice is drinking ayahuasca and doing what the shaman tells you to do. And trying to follow that. And it's well, what does my soul tell me to do? What are the other practices that might complement this? What does a good break cycle look like?
Right.
And pump the brakes every couple months or years.
Yeah, and I think, the point you're making to me also just raises the larger question about cultural appropriation just in general, because it's sort of like taking practices that are embedded within cultural and social contexts and extrapolating them to suit a specific, completely different context, and thinking that that's, kind of an appropriate.
I jump there with Americanized Tibetan Buddhism sometimes too. I'm just and we live in Boulder, so
right.
I guess we don't. I don't. We are in Boulder.
Right.
We'll say that. Yeah, and it's an interesting frame, and it's it's an interesting set of challenges to weave our way through. Yeah. I don't know what the answer is.
I don't pretend to know the answer either, but I do think that what I hear repeatedly from lineage carriers and indigenous people, which, also noting that this is not a monolith, that there, the expectation that there be a monolithic view that is the so-called indigenous or Native or First Nations view obviously is mistaken, but commentary that I hear repeatedly is slow down and just leave it alone, particularly certain medicines that are really deeply situated inside of the lineages and cultures and traditions and technologies that have been developed in relationship with those medicines over hundreds, if not thousands of years. And that's just not something that Westerners want to hear, and that's an uncomfortable, inconvenient truth, right? That we might, and it's if you want to just ignore
we'll always
that.
Have acid.
Right.
But the rest of it, right, it's the whole conversation is really complex. There's this two kind of major things. I tell people to stay away from toad-sourced 5-MeO-DMT very regularly for a lot of reasons. And then I regularly suggest people of European descent stay away from peyote because there's not enough for NAC. And NAC is now importing it from Mexico, and that's impacting the huichol.
Right.
And like, how do we want to interact with that? And I haven't seen Europeans doing peyote ceremonies, and it's really troubling. And
Right.
NAC wants to be at the table when we're talking about this stuff. And nobody's really like, there's all these new religious movements around 5-MeO-DMT inside Native communities that I find really interesting. But like, I feel like that should be a really exceptional case. And I'm like, cool, you're tribal people. These toads are on your land.
Right.
Cool. I'm going to be like, no evidence of historical use, but you guys are, you've been abused plenty. You can do what you want with your place. But like, I still think we need to be really careful, because does this movement want the blood of extinction of a species on its hands? I like to think the answer is no. But the more 5 people I talk to, they're just like, yeah, we know it's going to be extinct eventually, but this is just why it's worth it. But synthetic is so cheap and available and safer. Like, mind-boggling.
Right. Right. And mind-boggling, disturbing, and the sickness and the warped thinking that is embedded in this, to me, I just feel like there's no healing or spiritual growth or evolution or consciousness expansion for any individual or even, group, especially, kind of elite and highly privileged group, that is ever really justifiable at the expense of the level of harm and impact to whole communities and species of beings, right? Whether it's the toad, whether it's ayahuasca, which is endangered, whether it's peyote, which is endangered. I mean, the habitat destruction and the real risk of, extinction of some of these beings, is not, I feel, doesn't really justify and then, kind of the whole communities that are affected as well by tourism or extraction and so on.
Like, my religion requires a round trip to Iquitos like 5 times a year. Like that kind of stuff. I think we, in the context of climate change and environmental social justice, like, we need to really be aware of that. And and further, like, not further, you mentioned something about ayahuasca in danger status. Like, do you have any kind of like sources for that? Like, I've seen it both ways. Like, I think how I've landed to like sit with it is that the people that need it have to work harder and harder to get it. Amazon's vast, though burning at a accelerating rate, but like, they just have to work a lot harder to get it. So I don't know like if that qualifies as endangered or not, but it's like decreased access that's substantial.
Yeah, I mean, the habitat destruction is significant from deforestation. Yeah. So that's like, and not only is that the home of the vine, but it's also the lungs of our planet. I mean, we have a really big problem here. Like, that's a huge problem. And, when we think about rights of nature and the beingness of the natural world that has a right to exist for its own merit, not for what we can extract from it, all of that is a significant problem. And, the communities that live in relationship with and are, indigenous to the Amazon region, I mean, because the vine takes decades to mature, whether access is completely limited, whether it's endangered to the same level of, peyote, for example, maybe not, regions, but absolutely. In specific regions, perhaps. But the heart of the matter is, this is an extractive approach, right? And, the whole point, again, about legalizing or decriminalizing, I should say, a living being, a plant medicine, a master plant that is not native to this continent, through our legal system, I mean, I feel is, and again, this is coming as, an abolitionist I don't believe that, there ever should have been, the drug war or colonial repression and, kind of suppression of these medicines to begin with. But I think that it's sort of the final stage of colonialism when ultimately, the extraction of what remains of the culture at any price, basically, including, kind of the impacts of ayahuasca tourism, like you mentioned, and the impacts of flying, to the jungle numerous times a year. I mean, I think that we can't ignore that we're, deeply participating in coloniality when we are engaging in those practices. And I don't mean to say, I think that the term decolonization is such a really excessively used term that gets
we need more niche angles on that term so we can mean what we mean better.
Yeah. I mean, I have spent a lot of time studying decolonial scholars from the global South and their framing about what coloniality is and how we can begin to divest, from colonial practices, ways of living that uphold coloniality, which ultimately is an inherently violent system, right? And that's just the fact of the matter, the global matrix of power. The U.S. and the West, this is really kind of only a piece.
Boil it down
right?
to like, this is mine now.
Right.
I'm gonna go.
Yeah.
So like I appreciate that the DEA has admitted the war on drugs was founded for racist reasons in their museum. I need to go visit that so I can photograph it. Anybody in Arlington wants to do that for me, thank you. But yeah, I think it's interesting, right? Like I want the drug war to go away right now because I don't believe anybody should be getting incarcerated for doing this kinds of stuff. And because it abstracts us from our self-ownership in a lot of ways, and it's just not a good use of our resources. I think it's many billions, if not $1 trillion war on drugs at this point, which, imagine feeding people, helping them get homed instead with that money. And just the long-term multiple generations of harm that have happened and will continue to happen from this war that I hope will end soon. But I don't really see it. It's hard for me to like balance, like, what is that appropriate next step? I think perhaps there could be a petition, like a 2-year petition period to say, well, what substances don't you want illegal and why? Or don't want legalized and why? And then what is the individual cultural frame around each plant, I guess, or fungi? It gets really complicated when we start talking about things like variants on the psilocybin molecule, variants on the mescaline molecule, for instance, things like 2CB and or like 4-HO-DMT, like this whole set of molecules that theoretically, there's some IP from God that we're trying to figure out here. But like, how much do you need to modify the molecule for it to be decolonialized? And I think this is a really interesting question. I have zero answers, but it's fun to think about.
Yeah. And I don't know that there's necessarily consensus that extracting the molecule is actually a solution, because I'm aware that...
Oh, I'm talking about synthetic variants that aren't even close to isolated from extracted or isolated.
Synthetics for sure are, I think, a different story. Yeah, in terms of not necessarily
when I talk to native elders, it gets really confused. And they're like, well... it's a drug and drugs are bad. Just like, there's a black box warning, like it's going to have all these side effects. I'm like, perhaps, but like, we don't know that necessarily. And it's, as you probably know, it's challenging to have conversations with elders from different traditions.
Indeed.
Though worthwhile and really important. So a topic that we were excited about to chat about at the beginning was this concept of like guardianship and like, how do we create safe spaces? And, from the clinical framework, we know like, okay, here's what the Hopkins protocol looks like. Seems pretty successful. Here's the MAPS protocol looks pretty successful. Cool. It's quote unquote safe. I think, in this world, everybody wants perfect safety, and you can't have perfect safety and be alive at the same time. Or you have to be really specific about what safety means. But there's theoretically, and I've experienced this, things out there that we can interact with in non-ordinary states or holotropic states or psychedelic states, and you can have interactions with them. I've seen some really spooky stuff, not even in psychedelic landscapes, in like kind of magical frames and or ritual frames. And my one friend that at age 16 had a little bit too much acid at a fish show and got like in trouble in the porta potty for a few hours. Like, I saw some really weird impact on him 10 years later. And like, I don't want to get super specific because trying to be taken seriously sometimes, but I've seen some shit. And I get the sense that there is a reality to a lot of these non-human energies and entities that we have to be somehow negotiating. And it doesn't look super clinical. Like you do your therapy degree, you're not thinking you have to deal with exorcism or like spirit attachment or energy attachment or obsession or whatever it is. Like there's a lot of stuff that can go on, and there's a lot we don't know, thus the slowdown of conversation.
Exactly.
But like, how do you, like, given the orientation of Naropa being like founded by a Tibetan Buddhist leader, and like there's all this guardianship baked into that practice. Like I got to witness a mandala creation recently in Santa Fe, and it was amazing to like see how complicated and beautiful that work is, and like calling in the protector spirits for days and days and days by a lot of people. Like that's not what the MDMA protocol looks like. I have a framework from the holotropic breathwork perspective where Swami Muktananda is still protecting all of us in that lineage, and in a way like potentially protecting the MDMA stuff. But this is a weird, obscure metaphysical theory I have that has no grounding in like objective fact that I can point to. But like, how do you like to think about this whole thing?
Yeah, well, as I shared my background as a cultural anthropologist, all of the unseen realms and the notion of esoteric, metaphysical entities and beings is not, for me, really anything that is that much of a stretch or for me, that this is a given. I recognize that within the epistemology and ontological worldview of Western materialist reductionist science, you can't even have these conversations without sounding like you're just absolutely, bonkers. But that really doesn't concern me, because I don't know. I believe that
you get to exist at Naropa, which makes it a lot more safe.
It is, I found a good, home for the time being in that. So yeah, I think that, again, I should add to that my own personal lineage and background and foundation that has been informed by studying with a number of maestros and curanderos from various traditions over the years, as someone who has been a practitioner in the healing arts for several decades. And for me, my background in, although, as I mentioned, naturopathic medicine is a pretty fringe branch of healthcare, but it still, we study all of the Western diagnostic and treatment protocols. It's not really, it's integrative. And that with my mode of practice, I was studying, and practicing epigenetics and genomics and the intersection of, micronutrient therapies on, the epigenome and how to, and so that's fascinating. And I love the science, and I love even the exploration of the way that psychedelic medicines can potentially inform and influence and shape and transform the epigenetic code and the, have impact on the autonomic nervous system through activation of the vagus nerve, et cetera. All of that stuff is fascinating. It's no less, fascinating, though, than for me access to the unseen realm that I believe is opened up when we access those subtler planes of consciousness through non-ordinary states, however they are induced, whether it's through various psychedelics or entheogens, whether it's induced by extensive fasting, which I've myself partaken in, to kind of have some of these transcendent experiences. So I don't need to really have a Western, double-blind placebo-controlled trial to demonstrate for me, to my satisfaction, that there are subtler realms that we have the apparatus to perceive if we expand our consciousness enough to be subtle enough to receive them. Most of the time, we are just not attuned to them. And that is how in modernity, coloniality, we exist as though the physical material reality is all there is. But that's not the way that human beings exist on this planet universally, nor has it been the standard, throughout our evolution on the planet. So I believe that traditional ecological knowledge is empirical evidence-based knowledge. And I know that there's, kind of a rich tradition and bodies of cultural knowledge, from all over the planet where communities have been and continue to be in relationship with the ancestor spirits, with other beings, that have extensive ritual and offerings and, engage with these spirits. Now, when we're talking about safety, just because you aren't aware or in engagement with and in relationship with these subtler realms doesn't mean that they don't exist. And if you are in a clinical trial where you're limited in your purview and you're not necessarily, kind of creating a container to have a, ensure that the portal is opened and closed safely, and you're not obviously that's not the time and place where there's going to be a high level of attentiveness to that. But, I personally, for myself, believe that a ceremonial container, that would be the only way that I would want to hold space with the medicine, and that's not strictly what I'm here to teach in a, therapeutic framework, or even a state regulatory framework. It's a facilitation model. I'm not here to be, training people as ceremonialists, but for myself, that's where my personal leaning is, because I believe that, part of the responsibility of doing this work in a deep way requires the level of spiritual care that actually does make the offerings, that actually does, pray to the protective spirits for days before you open the portal, and so on.
Is there any kind of angle that you would take in trying to introduce some of these concepts to clinicians? Like we do it because we're really rooted in transpersonal psychology and Groff, and that opens the door for all these traditions quite nicely, and the potential utility of a lot of the traditions for like keeping people safe.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it's challenging, but also just say these are experiences people have had and come back and reported with. These are traditions that have been around for a very long time. They can be useful for you. See what speaks to you. It's kind of like how I think we position it in our worlds.
Yeah.
But like, how do you like to, think about how you might try to say, hey, like clinician, like you're an amazing clinician, but check these things out.
Well, yeah, I will say, as you mentioned, we're teaching here from Naropa. So we bring in the wisdom of some of our faculty that are here on staff, including some of our contemplative studies, faculty that come in and lead very deep processes that very much induce non-ordinary states and kind of assist folks with developing some of the framework for maybe tending to, some of those more kind of esoteric or subtler realms. And we also feature indigenous lineage carriers themselves that will come in and speak to the way that they are oriented, kind of to those aspects of this work, which are, maybe unique to their culture, but give folks kind of an example or a framework of what is out there. And that, I think that when it comes to clinicians and clinical care, particularly since, at least at this time within the medical model, I don't know that this is so much embedded within the adult use facilitation framework, although we do kind of still teach to this in that training as well. We're still kind of approaching this from the interdirective care or non-directive care framework, which does not prescribe, please come in, set up a ritual, cast your circle, call in the directions, like that's not, if you negotiate that, if that is what, the client is seeking, if that's their own, orientation, and or if that's what you yourself are steeped in, and that's what you kind of hold yourself out as being, kind of part of your offering offering. I think that's really different from, I think that you can expose people to a range of different approaches and ways of, being with this work, and still recognize that it's going to be such a spectrum. There's so many different ways to do this. And, what I don't think, similarly to how we wouldn't say, well, because this lineage carrier came and spoke to, this is their, tradition and how they hold ceremony and kind of hold that container and create safety. We certainly aren't expecting that people are then going to go take that and do that. That speaker may say, here are some things that you can do within your practice, and many of our speakers have and do that. Belinda Aracho, who is one of our faculty advisors who has taught in our program these last few years, will often say, here are the pieces that you can and should incorporate. What are your lineages? Like, where are your people from? Like, what are your ancestors? Who is, kind of your connection from the spirit realm? Those are my words, but, sort of how can you orient a place? What is, kind of sacred to you? Like, how do you set your own intentions? And, just getting people, thinking about those elements that are maybe accessible and within the framework of, kind of the Western mind and culture, because I think unless you've spent a lot of time in contexts, whether they're Tibetan Buddhism or, indigenous lineages or, some other kind of spiritual context where you become deeply practiced in those things, to really try to take them on or collect, kind of a basket of them. It may or may not be authentic. So I think it's a little bit of a mixed bag, when we're thinking about how to approach this with clinicians. So.
It's complicated for sure, but important. Belinda teaches for us sometimes too. I want to go back to this concept of hurt people that we hear a lot, and the European soul is very damaged from colonization too.
Yes,
we got colonized just many hundreds of years before, and our medicine people were very skillfully exterminated, and we don't really know our traditions all that well anymore. And I think there's some traditions hiding out in the hills of Romania and some parts of Ireland, probably the Nordics. But this is something that we need to keep leaning into and figuring out, who are we, where do we come from, what is mine and what is not mine, and there's a lot of scholarship needed here to help us and support us in this process. We can say, oh, okay, yeah, you're right. This weird neo-pagan Greek thing actually does speak to me. Cool. Great. And then we can stop doing, manipulation and taking of others' things. Yeah. And I think it's a really important point.
Yeah, I think, in what you're speaking to about the trauma and grief of culture loss for European descended people is huge and very much unrecognized largely, and not commented on and not really addressed. And the folks that I know that are really deeply engaged in ancestral lineage repair and reconnection, who are European descended people, it's some of the most inspiring, profound work that I have seen. And I think the impact of that has the potential to be so transformative. I'm really honored to have had the opportunity to collaborate with Tema Okun, who is an elder in the anti-racism field. She's been doing anti-racism, anti-oppression work and training with institutions and organizations for several decades. She's the author of the Characteristics of White Supremacy Culture that has circulated really widely. And she works with white folks on this very thing. She, herself, kind of through her own, kind of lineage work and, and I think, as an example of someone who has really kind of gone deeply into that. And there are many others. Some of my close friends and colleagues that deeply engage with lineage, kind of restoration. And like you said, a lot of those traditions are lost. It's not like you can go to, a family member or dig in the archives. And sometimes it's, genealogical data. Sometimes it's, kind of learning what has persisted in, kind of folklore, mythology, food, understanding the landscape, kind of gaining whatever factual knowledge that can be had. And then sometimes it's actually access through non-ordinary states, right? That can, kind of give us all, I believe, access to the ancestral realms and to those lineages, regardless of how those states are induced, right? And I'm really thrilled that some close friends and collaborators that do anti-racism work with European descended folks, white-bodied people, are doing that work in the psychedelic space, kind of working deeply with the medicine and the neuroplasticity to unpack the roots of the, kind of embedded, injected, white supremacy culture that really at its core has a lot of trauma and, is harmful for everyone, right? I mean, you mentioned, the colonialism, hurts us all. I mean, it's very true.
As if you and I aren't colonized.
Right,
in a lot
exactly.
of interesting ways and mostly not helpful ways, right? Yeah, there's so much. Thanks for that. Yeah, yes, we have a lot of privilege, but also plenty of trauma too. Multiple generations of religious trauma.
Yeah.
I think exists almost everywhere, everybody in America. And, thus the new scientism religion, which is, traumatizing people in other ways. And yeah, I'm going to a conference soon on process philosophy, and it's kind of like the antithesis of logical positivism, which is I think really important for us to flesh out and how do we have a philosophy we can lean on and work forward with as this strange global project continues to unfold. Not, I mean the project of humanity, not necessarily the psychedelic project, but that's one sub aspect. So, all right, anything we didn't necessarily cover? I'm sure we could go on for ages if we wanted to.
Not that I can think of. We
favorite
kind of
psychedelic
hit on
book?
Oh, geez.
I'm sorry. You could do top 3.
Okay, I don't even. I'm like, what even would I say? Okay, so I don't know if this counts. There's. Okay, there are a couple of things that I'm reading right now. So one, which just actually came to mind when you were sharing that last piece. Anti-oppressive psychotherapeutic practice by my friend and colleague Flory St. Amy, who is a therapist as well as a psychedelic assisted practitioner and an educator in the psychedelic space. She teaches with Gatherwell. Anyway, absolutely brilliant. And the kind of last comment that you made kind of made me think about, one of the things she writes about in her book, which is I don't even know if it references psychedelics, maybe, but I haven't finished it. But in any case, because she's really, deeply embedded in praxis, she's kind of talking about what even is, kind of an anti-oppressive approach and sort of examining throughout the, last several hundred years of, human history, how this, the assumptions that, modernity, coloniality, kind of Western culture and mindset are predicated upon, and sort of what the, kind of antithesis or remedy for that is, which, ultimately is relationship and overturning neocortical supremacy, kind of this over-reliance on our frontal lobe and, kind of the rational thought as the, supreme master, and getting into the limbic system and being in your body, right? And she's like, no, the limbic system actually has greater intelligence, and that's what we need for these times. We're not going to be able to think our way out of this. So that's just brilliant. I highly recommend. And then, when you mentioned, psychedelic books, the first thing that came to mind, I just picked this up and haven't opened it yet, but it's an homage to Groff's work, Psyche Unbound. I was actually in Santa Fe recently and got
a collection of essays, right?
Yeah.
Oh, you went.
I was in I went to Synergetic Press, saw
Yes.
Synergia Ranch.
So
it was
gorgeous.
amazing. Very cool. And, had the opportunity to meet some very amazing luminaries, and grabbed a copy of that book while I was there. And Grof's work has been really deeply influential to me. And I know that one of the contributors to the book is Rick Tarnas, who his longtime friend and collaborator, who's an astrologer. And, this is probably the topic that I'm most passionate about,
Astrology.
Oh, yeah. Speaking of sort of
I feel like we wasted this interview.
Well,
Kidding.
you'll have to have me back. We'll talk for an hour about just astrology, because really that's the thing. I'm doing some writing myself, really kind of looking at the ways in which planetary transits and alignments are a factor of set and setting, which, obviously Grof, wrote about that and collected decades of client data, kind of ultimately concluding that astrology was the Rosetta Stone of psychedelic therapy in terms of determining what kind of outcome the client would have. Same patient, same dose, same medicine. What's different? The timing, right? And, kind of pointing to these, just because we're getting again into some of the more esoteric woo stuff. I mean, the way that I understand it, it's pattern recognition. The planets don't make anything happen. They're not like emitting some force. It's not like they're doing something, but it's just like the clock on the wall, that says, what time it is. The planets and these great sweeping cycles of time are, predecessors who observed these planetary movements over millennia. Again, it's, empirical knowledge that was collected over thousands of years and, with incredible precision, because many of the prophecies that are coming to culmination in these times, kind of predicted that this would be a time of great turning, right, in human history. And really, all of this came about just through observation, right? And, kind of recognizing the patterns of the planetary movements, the movements of the astral bodies. So anyway, I like to think about that in terms of this work, how we can work with it, how we can be in relationship with the cosmos, and, really kind of anchor ourselves as being, a member of this web of existence, kind of in communion, right, with the natural world, including the planetary movements. And so I have a practice of, observation and tracking all of these things.
So people should, before I really would engage with anybody in conversation around that, watch 2 videos with Rick Tarnas, and then read Cosmos and Psyche and get back to me.
Yeah.
And then we can go further.
Exactly.
Sean Kelly was the co-author on that one. He's clever too. I had him on at the release of that book.
Okay, cool.
He's great.
Nice. I haven't read his work yet, but yeah, I mean, Cosmos and Psyche is dense, and I don't know if you've caught the Changing of the Gods series that Tarnas made just a couple of years ago. Okay, it's a video. Cool. It's a series of videos. They're on maybe Amazon. You can stream them.
I'll be picking it up.
Please check it out. It's basically sort of a video recap of the conclusions of Cosmos and Psyche. So he's looking at the outer planets and the way that their movements and aspects to each other over long cycles of time have these recurring patterns, and he tracks throughout Western history. It's, it is centralized through European history specifically, but, just kind of tracks how major human turning points, revolutions, uprisings, cultural, moments have coincided with some of these movements of the transpersonal outer planets. And yeah, so brilliant. So his book, everything that he writes, his daughter, Becca Tarnas, is also brilliant. I interviewed her for a book that I'm working on this subject on psychedelics and astrology.
Oh,
so yeah.
Damn. All right. Well, yeah, we're going to be friends.
Okay.
So it's great.
Great.
So, we don't include it really as part of our curriculum, but we do. I think we used to do a series pretty regularly on YouTube with one of Tarnas's students. I can't remember the guy's name, and I feel really bad about it. But one of the major contributors to this archetypal astrology topic, I think top 2, Ren Butler was his name.
Oh, nice.
Yeah,
okay,
Ren's
fantastic.
Lovely. He has a lot of experience with the Grof world too. So yeah, I do love that frame. And worth noting that some famous psychiatrists used to do this before encountering their patients, particularly Carl Jung. I'm sure it was not him alone. I'm sure it was others.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a long history. And I mean, but Groff writes in a paper on the subject, on Set and Setting, that in all of his years of work in psychedelics, which is such a completely kind of cutting edge, radical, fringe, outside of the mainstream approach to mental health, that the most obscure and kind of risky move that he made in his career was to speak openly about astrology. That was actually the thing that was like least accepted.
The acid.
Right? It wasn't the acid.
Go figure. Yeah. Yeah, he's such a sweetheart, and I'm so glad he took the bold move to do that. And it's edgy. It's edgy for all of us to talk about it, because all of a sudden we won't get invites to certain places, but kind of whatever. But I think, somehow I've been able to feather this and still be taken seriously by real deal scholars and in the materialist sense. And it's lovely. It's lovely to be able to exist in a weird in-between space. So anything else we want to mention? No, I'm complete.
We've covered astrology. And so now I'm like, yes, okay, definitely. Yeah.
Guardians on astrology. Perfect. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. So Diana Quinn, until next time, I hope we can do more and maybe even in-person events. And best of luck with the Naropa programs. And I'm excited to see how it all plays out for everybody.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And there you have it, everybody. Diana Quinn and D. I hope you all liked that one. I certainly did. And I learned quite a bit about things happening over at Naropa, and that Diana Quinn and I have some mutual interests. So let's keep in touch about what's going on over at Naropa. We'll keep you informed. I hope you go check out what's happening over there as well. And we will see you on the next episode. This is Joe Moore signing off. Bye-bye.